Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. My name is Ross, and I'm an immigration lawyer. Thank you very much for tuning in. We've got an awesome episode for you. Today, I will be discussing a number of different issues that have been happening in migration. Now, specifically, what I want to talk about is our topic of the week, which is 5 most common mistakes that people make when putting together a skills assessment. In addition to that, I want to address the question that relates to visitor visa refusals. I know that visitor visa refusals are quite prominent at the moment, so therefore I do want to talk about how do we minimize that chance of having a visitor visa refused and what can be done in order to maximize your chances of receiving an approval. Now, if you'd like to be featured on one of our podcast sessions, all you have to do is send us an email, inquiries@crystalmigration.net, or email me directly, ross@crystalmigration.net. If you like this channel, please do subscribe and share it so that we can bring you the most relevant content that we can. Now sit back and enjoy today's episode. Now, moving on to question of the week. Should I pick employer-sponsored visa or should I go via the general migration scheme pathway? Now, the choice is entirely personal, whether you want to be sponsored by an employer or whether you want to go down the general skill migration stream. So rather than giving you the right answer based on merely a personal opinion, let's talk about some of the differences. So let's start off with the employer-sponsored permanent residency. Now, what are some of the benefits? Well, the most obvious benefit is that you don't need to be invited by the state or a territory. So therefore, if you have an employer and they do want to sponsor you for permanent residency, you will be able to apply for permanent residency without having to wait and get an invitation from the state, having to go through the process of skills assessment. Remember, not all permanent residency pathway via the employer nomination scheme carry a skills assessment, so therefore it can be viewed as somewhat of a faster pathway. If you recall our first episode, we talked about the allocations available for 2023 and also the ceiling levels as well for 2023. And whilst the ceiling levels for general skill migrations remain fairly high, the allocations for general skill migration is quite low, and that's because there are too many applications in a pipeline. So one of the benefits in applying for permanent residency via the employer nomination scheme is that ability to lodge the application straight away when your employer is ready to nominate you. The other benefit is that if you are working in a particular occupation and that occupation is sponsorable, it could be a matter of transitioning your temporary visa onto permanent residency, so therefore the process may be less cumbersome for you. The employer would have already provided a lot of the documents as part of the temporary visa stage, so therefore the process of applying for permanent residency, whilst it does involve a brand new application, it may not be as cumbersome. Now, let's move on and talk about general skill migration. The great option when it comes to general skill migration, or I suppose a bit of freedom when it comes to general skill migration, is the ability to not be reliant on an employer. It can potentially be a cheaper pathway because you have one application as opposed to 2 going in. Now, when I say 2 applications, I'm referring to the employer nomination scheme being a nomination and a visa application. With general skill migration, you don't have that. You're not tied to an employer, and in most circumstances, occupations that are in a managerial role, in professional role, trades, and also technicians would be on a state or territory occupation list. So therefore, if you are working in an occupation as a manager or a professional or in trades or a technical role, you may be eligible to receive a state or territory nomination. Now, when it comes to receiving a state or territory nomination, one of the most common questions I get asked is, do I need to live in that particular state or territory? Well, the answer to that is you need to make a genuine commitment to remain in a particular state or territory. General commitment or genuine commitment is different to a sponsorship obligation. Therefore, if at the time of application you intend to live in the state or territory which the nomination is linked to, and later down the track, say a year down the track or 2 years down the track, you decide to move to a different state or territory for work purposes, for example, it's unlikely that this will have any negative impact on your visa. But just do keep in mind that in order to obtain a general skilled migration visa, you do need to be invited by the state. So this brings us back to the question that we've discussed in our previous episodes: how soon will I receive that invitation? And that all depends on the number of points that you have been allocated based on your age, English language ability, skills, qualifications, and also, more importantly, the number of places available for your particular occupation. So therefore, you might be sitting on 100 points, but if you're competing with say 1,000 people who are also sitting on 100 points, then that may not necessarily be an indication that you will receive your invitation. So therefore, when it comes to choosing whether you want to apply for the employer-sponsored permanent residency or take your own pathway and go down the general skilled migration, have a think about whether you have a good relationship with your employer and therefore you can negotiate the terms of permanent residency, or whether you don't want to be tied to an employer and want to explore your own options. Our topic of the week today is skills assessments. Particularly what I wanted to discuss are some of the common mistakes that people make when they apply for a skills assessment. Now, what I'm going to be discussing are the 5 common mistakes that I see when someone puts together a skills assessment application. The first one is knowing which skills assessment body is the right skills assessment body for you. For example, if you're an engineer, Engineers Australia. If you are in a professional occupation, it may be VETASES. However, if you are in accounting, there are 3 separate skills assessing bodies. Now, it's important to understand which skills assessing body you're going to use, because there are over 20 skills assessing bodies available, and more importantly, each skills assessment body has different types of evidence that they would want to see in order to get you a positive skills assessment. So knowing which skills assessing body to use is the number one most crucial factor in your skills assessment journey, but it can also be the most common mistake that one can make. Now, the second point is qualifications. Australia operates on the Australian qualification framework, and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult if you have an international qualification. It may be not recognised at the same standard as an Australian qualification. To give you an example, a bachelor degree from Brazil, for example, may not equate to a bachelor degree in Australia. Similarly, a bachelor degree from India may not necessarily equate to a bachelor degree in Australia. So therefore, it's important to understand that the qualification that you have in your home country matches up with the Australian qualification framework. Number 3, employment reference letters. Now, not all skills assessing bodies require you to have relevant employment experience. In fact, some don't require you to have any employment experience in order to get a skills assessment. Now, that's a critical factor to understand. So under what circumstances would you want to get your employment assessed? Now, that might be if you want to claim points for general skill migration, or perhaps it could be a mandatory requirement. But if you are going to get your employment assessed, it's important to understand how a particular skills assessing body wants you to present the reference letter. For example, certain skills assessing bodies actually provide you with a template for the employer to fill out, and that might contain your duties, your responsibilities, the number of hours that you work per week. So it's important to understand and read the guidelines so that you don't fall into the trap of potentially having insufficient employment experience when in fact the real issue is providing incorrect document. So therefore, providing correct employment reference letters and understand how they work is the third common mistake when it comes to putting together skills assessments. Now, mistake number 5, evidence of pay. When it comes to employment reference letters and evidencing employment, there needs to be evidence that the employment was paid. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. The most common reason for that is to ensure that the work that was performed is at the required skill level. So therefore, if someone was doing, say, an internship or unpaid work or training, perhaps there may be concern that the kind of work that someone has done is potentially not at the required skill level. So therefore, in most circumstances, if you are going to be putting an employment reference letter in order to get your employment assessed, it would generally need to be accompanied by evidence of pay. Now, in terms of how much evidence do you submit, well, it largely depends on what skills assessing body you use. So to give you an example, VETAssess requires you to submit evidence of pay to evidence the start of your employment, the middle of your employment, and the very end of your employment. So if you had 1 year that you want to assess, you would be submitting pay slips for the first month, month number 6, and month number 12. And fifth most common mistake is rushing the skills assessment. Now, I completely understand and I get it from an applicant's perspective. And if you're a migration agent or a practitioner, maybe your client is rushing you to lodge the application, but there is nothing worse than rushing an application, and it's just not worth getting a negative assessment because you've lodged the application for the sake of lodging. For example, if you're missing a particular document, it may be trivial. For example, a passport photo, or maybe you're waiting on that one extra pay slip that will take a couple of days. Remember, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So therefore, it's important that you have all of your documents available and your application is decisioned. So whilst there might be somewhat of a level of frustration in waiting for all the documents to be prepared, it's paramount to lodge a fully documented application as opposed to lodging an incomplete application and expecting a skills assessment body to come back to you and request further information. So just to recap, 5 most common mistakes when it comes to putting together a skills assessment application: not knowing your skills assessing body, not understanding how Australian qualification framework works, providing insufficient or incorrect employment reference letters, not having your reference letters backed up by evidence of payment, and last but not least, and probably the most important, rushing the application. This week in our podcast, we also discuss visitor visas and specifically refusals of visitor visas. Now, it has been a trend for quite some time where visitor visas, unfortunately, get refused, and the refusal rate of these visitor visas are quite high. Now, there's no particular pattern per se. Some say that there are visitor visas that get refused from a particular country. Others say it could be based on the profile of the applicant. But the reality is, when you look at a visitor visa application, there is what's called a genuine visitor test. And that particular test is a very discretionary test applied by the case officer who assesses the application and can genuinely come to a conclusion that someone is not a genuine visitor. So what are some of the common trends that is seen in immigration for visitor visa refusals? Now, there are a number of factors, the first one being age. If you've got an applicant who is between the age of 18 to 45, unfortunately, these applications do see a high refusal rate. Now, the reason for that is because these applicants are able to lodge another application in Australia, such as sponsored visa or potentially general skilled migration or another pathway. Skilled migration in Australia does carry the age cutoff of 45, so therefore these applicants are likely, not necessarily will do so, but are likely to have other options in Australia. So therefore, age does play a factor. We do find that if an applicant is more mature, say of a pension age, these applications for visitor visas do tend to get approved quite fast and more frequently because there are more incentives to return back home. And on the note of incentives to return back home, what sort of information should you provide? Now, this depends on your profile. If you're a single applicant, the intention to return home may be a little bit more difficult to prove, but looking at elements such as whether there is property, whether there is an incentive to return back to a full-time employment or part-time employment, or whether there is any extended family as well. So that's really important. If you've got a family and you're traveling by yourself, then the incentive to return home will be greater. Now, the other important element when it comes to visitor visas is it's important to tie a visitor visa to a particular event. So for example, if you are applying for a visitor visa, it's not necessary, but it may be a good idea to put forward a statement from the applicant, yourself, as to what the purpose of the visit is. Now, that could be a wedding, that could be a family event, it could be a birthday, or maybe it's some sort of holiday or a religious gathering. Whatever the event might be, that's largely irrelevant, but if it's tied to a particular event, there are more chances of the application being approved. Now, the other important element is also to demonstrate that one has financial capacity to support themselves in Australia. There is no dollar figure that immigration looks at, but it needs to make sense for your trip. So, for example, if you're planning to visit Australia for, say, 3 months, there should be sufficient amount available for you to either access directly from your savings, or if you don't have savings, have a family member who would be able to cover your expenses. So therefore, if you are staying with maybe your relative or your sibling, it's a good idea to include those details in your statement, which specifies the reasons why you're planning to come to Australia, and that will mitigate the risks of having the application refused, and it will also give the delegate who's assessing your application a little bit more understanding about the purpose of your trip and also how you're going to support yourself. Now, visitor visas do contain quite a number of documents which may, when you look at them on their own, be a little bit out of context or may not necessarily fit in with the picture. So it is important to also outline why you're submitting particular documents. Now, if you're submitting an itinerary to return back home, that might be evident that this is what you're submitting the itinerary for. However, other documents such as documents in relation to property, in relation to running a business back at home, may not necessarily be evident, especially if they are not in English. So therefore, it's always a good idea to put forward a submission which explains how the documents fit in with the genuine visitor test. Remember, the case officer is looking at a number of different factors, but all of them link to two elements: whether you intend to visit Australia genuinely and whether there is an intention or a genuine intention for you to return back home. So therefore, by putting forward a submission or putting forward some sort of statement, if you're not using a migration lawyer or an immigration advisor, putting together a submission will allow the case officer to understand why you're including particular documents. Now, whilst the tips and hints I've discussed may not necessarily result in an approval of the visitor visa, they will most certainly allow your case officer to perform a thorough assessment and understand the purpose of your visit and potentially ask for more information if there is anything in the application that may appear to be somewhat unclear. And that's all the time that we have for this week's episode 4 of Crystalcast. First and foremost, thank you very much for joining us, for supporting our podcast. If you like what you've heard, please ensure that you like and subscribe to our channel to get the latest updates and to be notified as soon as the new episode is released. Now, if you would like to be featured on our podcast as a guest, please feel free to email inquiries@crystalmigration.net. That's inquiries@crystalmigration.net. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our future episodes. Take care.